I've been sharing how I went no contact with my Nigerian father following a lifetime of chronic non-contact sexual abuse that started when I was 16. To hear that story, you have to go to the top of the video thread. But I also wanted to introduce myself because I forgot to do that. Hi, my name is Ikwa. I'm really healing from all my performative identities. So I don't really call myself anything at this time, but I have been a filmmaker, I've been a writer, I've been an entrepreneur, I've been a dancer, but right now I'm pretty much just healing in public. So Rich Auntie commented that everyone covers for the African man, and it felt important enough that I should make an entire video about the familial context of my abuse. So my parents both left Nigeria separately, and they met as college students in the States, and they got married in the 70s, and within about 6 years they had 4 daughters under 5 years old. I'm the youngest. So now we call it a Kwaibom state where they were from, and they were from neighboring villages. So it was quite serendipitous that they met. They met at a convention of people from our place, so I guess it wasn't like a surprise. But it's important to say that my dad didn't have any education before he got to the States. He was my grandfather's canoe boy. So this is my father, and this is my grandmother, and this is my grandfather, and this is my late Uncle Afyang, and also my grandparents are late. So my grandfather was a fisherman, and so my dad was his canoe boy, helping him to fish off the Atlantic coastline. So, long and short summary is that he faced several near-death experiences because he didn't even know how to swim, and eventually people went to my grandmother and they were like, "You need to stop sending that boy out in the canoe. He's gonna die." And they convinced her to send him to Lagos, where my Uncle Afyang was. And my father basically taught himself to read. He was apprenticed to a photographer. He opened up his own photography studio. It was through that he met someone who helped arrange for a visa for him to come to the States. And at 25, he sat in his first classroom in the US. And ultimately, he went on to get his doctorate in education. But when he was going for his doctorate, my mother essentially went up to her master's, and that's about when they got married. And then she worked 2 jobs to take care of the family while he finished his doctorate. And then they both got jobs working for the state, because I grew up in upstate New York. A lot of immigrants got jobs working for the state. Anytime you would go to any of the African community events, they would often thank our family because my parents were instrumental in helping to set up certain organizations and being in leadership. And we also had an African dance troupe, so we were always performing music, dance, culture, fashion, touring through universities and local schools. Like, everyone at school knew I was Nigerian because we were always putting on an assembly. Culture, we had a home back home in Nigeria, in addition to our house in the States, and so we were really close to our family in Nigeria. I think there's a part of me that actually thought there was something idyllic about my life growing up. At least it had an idyllic public-facing persona. So it was almost hard to sort of grapple with what was actually going on internally inside the family and how I was actually feeling, which sometimes felt incongruent to this public image that had been set up. That both my paternal and maternal grandfathers had multiple wives, because polygamy was prevalent at that time. And so I don't really know what my father learned about marriage and how to treat a woman and how to raise kids and all that. I don't think any of those conversations were really being had, if I'm being honest. And he had actually had a child with his girlfriend, and the baby ended up dying during the Civil War before he came to the States. My father had faced a lot of trauma, just like my mom, but he had faced a lot of trauma that I don't think he quite had processed through. Now, on my mother's side, my maternal grandfather was Chief Paul Basio Cone. He was a former president of the BBO Union, he was a businessman, he was an educator, and he was the first clan head of Atoi. And that matters because he had multiple wives, and my grandmother was not treated particularly well. She was often treated like a house girl. This is what I've been learning in my research from my family history. And my uncle tells me stories about how they would throw food on the floor for her to eat. And so she really wasn't treated very well. And my mother would have known that. He played favorites, and he was always kind of shuttling the wives and the children around. Like, my auntie was a house girl in somebody's house. So he was just doing what he was doing. He had many wives, he had many concubines. He didn't treat my grandmother particularly well. When he started convalescing near the end of his life, all of the wives ran away, and she was the only one who stayed to take care of him. And by then he had actually taken 2 teen brides, so they were girls. And she nursed him till he died. And then the home that she had been in as a house girl, which is the house that is in Calabar, we're from Akwa Ibom, but he was a businessman and he was running the Ibibio Union from Calabar. So she actually went and was installed in that house, and my granny lived most of her life in that house in Calabar. So it's sort of like, it's a transformational story, I guess you could say. And my mother, she would have seen all of this, and she would have seen this mistreatment, and it would have been heavily normalized. There was a strong missionary influence in this part of Nigeria, and my mother actually, the story is that she wanted to be a nun, but my uncle didn't want her to be a nun because he thought that she should have more economic opportunities. So he went and brought her from Nigeria to the States so she could go to school. It's also important to note that in addition to being a devout Catholic, my mother underwent female genital mutilation like her mother did, and all of the women before them in our line. And so it's important to understand that concepts around bodily autonomy, the concept of being clean as a woman, and that while I feel privileged to be among some of the first generations in my lineage of women to not have to undergo that procedure, that there are certain cultural, traditional, religious practices that are still exerting an influence, sort of like violences on me with respect to my bodily autonomy, my safety, my concepts around pleasure, relationships, marriage, and even motherhood. So when you consider these generational cycles and dynamics that normalized what you might just call toxic patriarchal abuse, you can understand why my experience growing up with my parents was my mother regularly accusing my father of cheating on her, him not really answering to it or really saying anything at all, or even really denying it. He would sometimes just stand there mutely and not say anything. She would blow up, they would get into fights, they would threaten to divorce, they would sleep in separate rooms. Oftentimes my father would be sending emails saying he's had it and he's gonna leave. There was a time that my mother woke me and my sisters up at like 2 in the morning to ask my father where he had been. And those kind of toxic dynamics in the household, but nothing ever really changed, nothing ever really happened. The explosion, the argument would not be discussed the following day, and things would just kind of go on and on and on like that. You can understand if this kind of toxic patriarchal abuse had been normalized in both of their lives, that it actually, to me, even though it felt really bad, it was normal for us. Like I didn't know, I did not know how problematic it was. I even have on video at one of the assemblies we put on at a school, and my mother was talking about marriages, how traditional marriages worked in Nigeria, and she said, because we had a tradition of polygamy, most women don't get that mad when their husbands cheat. I literally have my mother on video saying that, and at the time, my sisters and I were standing in the room waiting to perform, and so we were hearing her say this. We were both hearing her say this, we were watching her engage in these dynamics, we were watching my father engage in his behavior. I even have a memory of like going to a cafeteria once and seeing my dad there with the daughter of one of the women that my mom accused him of cheating on her with. And I remember constructing like a false narrative in my mind on the spot, and then turning around and leaving and not confronting him. Obviously, I would tell my mom to leave my dad because I knew she wasn't happy. I knew he didn't seem happy, and I knew I felt like I was being harmed given the chronic abuse I was suffering. And she would say, I'm staying for you guys, which would twist your mind apart if you're like the child telling the parent to leave and they say they're staying for you and you know you're being harmed. So to the commenter who wrote, thanks for sharing, everyone covers for the African man. Yes, that was exactly my experience growing up. That even death is a noble sacrifice if it maintains the position and power of the family patriarch. So now that I've gotten that context out of the way, I'm going to post more videos that kind of go deeper into my story. But thank you so much for this comment because I actually think it's really key.